try to be within the framing all the time, because you need a lunch. So, yeah, I'm going to try to pay attention. If not, Jesper, you will shout out. Yeah. So, these are the rest of the pedagogues, the teachers that we're going to have in this festival. So, first of all, since we start now with talking about Odin theater and cultural exchange, and we kind of try to see, I was thinking just if you can, for just brief moment in the beginning of this week, just think about the Nordic countries or Scandinavia from outside. So I would be curious, maybe I can start with Gianluca and Carmen-Lara, because you are both from outside of this part of the world, and you enter Norwegian society and acting environment and trying to figure out what this is. I don't know, I mean the story about the Jean Barba I think is quite interesting and important, this rejection. Hopefully something has happened with the Norwegian theater, I don't know, for the last 40 years. But I would be curious to hear your story about entering Norway or Nordic theater. And Nordic. Would you start, Carmen-Lara? I would love it. We have some mics here. Can you send it around?
That's a big question to start off. Speaking from my own experience, it's definitely a mixed message. I would say that Barbara's experience rings a little bit true. That on the one hand, there's such an incredible support for artistic research and for questioning where art practice is going and what our role as members of society is in that. And yet I have found, surprisingly at moments, a certain conservative trend towards maybe looking a little bit more towards, for example, Russia in the acting practice, the Russian tradition, and that the archive that has, sort of the traces that has led. That was one of my first encounters, is people being a little bit surprised that an actor doesn't have to have a master. An actor can be a free man or woman, even without a tradition. And to get into that dialogue with the actor as a creator, the actor as a maker, was, in my first year here, something I found to be an important role for me to play in holding up that position and saying, hey guys, you know, an actor doesn't need to be waiting around for a director or for a text. An actor is someone who makes something happen in space. And a lot can unfold from there. And technique is a tool that can be taken up and also abandoned. And so to have a relationship to discipline, a relationship to culture, to who you are, your roots, is really important. And that's a different thing. Yeah. There's a lot I didn't answer in your question, but that's okay.
No, it's an interesting beginning also, since you mentioned you have the feeling when you arrive here that there is a strong idea about having master and these kind of things. It's an interesting perspective.
It's not so stable. I mean, there's room for it to.
I would say that it's able to be destabilized, but it's surprising to find it within an environment that's also actually so supportive and curious about artistic research. So there's I think there are some growing pains in the Norwegian art discourse, more than the practice. Maybe it's the discourse around it.
And you connected it to Russia, which I would love really to respond to. But I think first I want to hear also Gianluca's experiences about landing in Norway.
Yes, it was cold. Okay. Well, first of all, I just also have to say that I feel very much sort of Norwegian now, in a way. So it's hard for me now to answer this question. I would probably answer this question in a very different way 6-7 years ago. And Norwegian, Norway has also gave me a lot. So has also defined me so I will try to separate between the pollution of becoming Norwegian and there will not be interaction technique probably without Norway. It's also like a sort of, I always believe that people have potentialities, and they find environments where these potentialities can develop. So in a very subconscious way, I was probably looking for Norway, and maybe Norway looking for me. So this is on a level. On the other level, there is a practical problem, which is to have a not Norwegian education. And when I sort of started to, I used a couple of years to sort of understand if I really wanted to be here or not, and I just was here partially, part-time. And it was really hard to encounter the professional life in Norway because it was really hard to get meetings, to get to talk, to get to present, to get to show, to get to sort of the chance to introduce yourself and what is your work about. So I thought I was surprised. In a way, I share this feeling of Barba, that in a way it was very sort of nice that now you're here in Norway and we like you, but work in the cafe, sort of thing. So there is this, it's a weird thing, you know. I could make an example. Can I make an example? Can I ask 2 people to come here? 2 volunteers? Come on, it's very simple. You don't have to do anything. Please, come. Yeah, come on. So that was my perception of what happens when I came to Norway. Can you go and be on? Can you stand up on the chair? Stand up. Can you come here? Can you look at him? Just look at him. How do you feel when you look at him?
I feel good.
Sit down. How do you feel now?
I feel small.
You feel small? Yes. Okay, so this was my sort of, this was the kind of dialogue. No, stay there. I was having, okay? What would happen if, so when I came here, I mean, everybody was smiling and very open, but they were really talking to me from a higher place. They were looking at me above. It was very sort of physical, and it was very hard to grasp yourself up, you know? And it's very tough for me. I'm Italian, I come from Rome, you know, Rome, Italian. We have an understanding of us and our culture as slightly more superior than the rest of the world. I'm sorry, but it's true. It's my education. I even come from Tuscany, which is like, you know, it was like I had to destroy many years of bad education, you know? So I come here and there are these people and they look at me down, but they do it smiling, you know? So when you look at him, can you tell him, we're very happy that you're here, and smile?
We're very happy that you're here.
But you know, you're still there, you know. So what I was, then there was a journey to get from this kind of conversation to, can you come down? Can you come up? How do you feel now?
I feel safe.
Yeah, it's different, right? Can you tell him that you're very happy that this guy's here?
I'm very happy that you're here.
It's very different, right? Thank you. Go. So that was yeah. So it was like it was a physical thing. On the way there was a communication which went in a direction, and there was a physical, and it was a journey. And I also, in the beginning, I was kind of, oh fuck them, and then after a while, I also realized, yeah, but you know, I also have to do something. So learning Norwegian, for example, was a very important thing that really changed the whole thing. For me, I really underestimated in the beginning. And then, yeah, so it takes some time, but maybe also Barbara should have insisted a bit more.
They should have stayed.
Yes, so I'm very grateful at this day. I'm very grateful to now consider myself also very Norwegian. I couldn't think about myself as not Norwegian now, but it's been a journey, and it's a tough journey, and I think that this thing I hope will slowly change in Norway, because there's nothing to be afraid of in exchanging from the same level. That's my point of view.
Then I'm wondering, because most Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, have their acting education is solely based mostly in Stanislavski, on the biggest institutions. And since you are the one that have done a lot of research with it, and you're Finnish, and also closer to Russia, I'm curious to hear what you're thinking about this topic of the master versus the student, the tradition of Russian acting, how you see this taking shape today, now, in the Nordic countries. You also know Sweden quite well, and how do you see this unfolding today? Where does it go?
It's a tricky question because I don't actually know how it takes place in all the Nordic countries and in theaters. And not in education. I can mostly speak about what we do in the Theatre Academy in Helsinki, where I've been working quite a lot and where I've also been doing my research. And it's quite similar, as you said, about the process has been a very, very long process, and I'm about to talk of this more on Friday when it's my interview. But just briefly about this kind of a hierarchy that exists in the theater, and it's I was graduated from the Theatre Academy in 1994, and it's been a problem for me all these years. I'm an actor, and I find it still a little bit uneasy, more and more uneasy to work with directors, and it's a very sad story because it's. We are so dependent on each other, actors and directors, and we're kind of the core pair, working pair in the theater. And what becomes to Russia, because we are so close to Russia, we try at the Theatre Academy now and then to collaborate with GITIS or with, that's the Theatre Academy in Moscow, or with St. Petersburg Theatre Academy, and it's not nice. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, they are very talented and they are very kind of artistically visionary. But I just recently, where the actor department started a collaboration with GITIS. I wasn't with them, but they went over to Moscow and they had some kind of collaboration. And we have 2 professors in acting, and the other one is a lady, a woman. And it's an impossibility for the Russians. They don't even talk to her, just because of the gender. So it's, when things are like this, it's not so easy to collaborate when we are rearranging our kind of these questions at the Theatre Academy more and more, and trying to find means to collaborate with the directors and choreographers, and we do a lot of collaboration. We have a long, long tradition at the Theatre Academy in Helsinki doing collaboration from the 70s on. We call it generation theater in a way, where actors, playwrights, dramaturgs, directors, and all kind of start from the beginning to work together. And now it's been more and more a collaborative way to work, that the directors aren't in the first beginning the persons who are making the decisions, but we are trying to find means to do things together. And always when we collaborate with the Russians or with the Eastern European directors or pedagogues, it is like this. And on the other hand, they are very great artists, so it's not easy. Okay.
It's an interesting description and meeting point. I would also like to ask Per about, I mean, you have been important to also establish another alternative technique or way of thinking and working with acting within the Nordic countries. And Göteborg has been important for establishing the OIAF technique. And I'm just curious to hear your perspective on these things, because I mean, you have kind of established small alternative tradition which have existed here now for a long time. How do you feel like being a more, if I can say, marginal way of thinking on working. How do you live with that as an institution and technique? I'm thinking again in the context of Nordic countries. Sweden.
Right. Yeah. First of all, I should say that the so-called technique is very connected with the Stanislavski tradition, mainly coming from the States and Uta Hagen. So that's a very important part, and you can't separate that from the rest. That is based on the movement analysis of Rudolf Laban. But of course, it has been considered kind of mysterious, and that's because Gert Malmgren didn't want to write about this. He didn't believe in writing it down. He believed in the experience of the student and of the actor and of the teacher. So it has been written very little about it. It's 2 books. It's a 3rd one coming out later, and some articles. It's very little written about it. But I find I was a student of Gert Malmgren when he was at our school in the 70s. And I find it very useful because it is so embodied. It's through the body you go to the mental and emotional qualities of, like you did here. It's the same. You say you're looking down at it. So it's even the mental and emotional factor it has is expressed emotions. So it's not really dance. It's more embodiment through movement, inner movement and outer movement. I don't know if you feel on the side.
But do you feel curiosity around the way you're working? Do you feel openness about this? Do you feel
I think it's less. It's good that it's written about. It's articles about it, and it's not that mysterious.
Because
the name is a little mysterious, but I can explain that tomorrow.
Because also I think in every country, all the Nordic countries, we have like some old theater schools with a formal tradition, very often connected to Stanislavski, and then there have been established more smaller acting training to begin with that have been growing. I don't know when Göteborg started, but in the 60s, 70s,
in the 1960s, and that's when Gert Malmgren came to the school and introduced this way of working.
Then I would be interesting to hear from you, Camilla, because also, I mean, Fredrikstad was established as a very important, I think, contrapoint for the theatre school, and a completely another way of thinking. I mean, you have been very occupied by the idea of being an international theatre school, while we have more been defined as a national, probably. Can you say something about these contrapoints in the Nordic countries or in Norway? How do you perceive that?
Well, I think Gianluca's example is interesting because I'm a Norwegian. I have a Norwegian passport, which I guess is what makes me Norwegian. But I have a training from Châtelet Coq in Paris, and I came back in '92 to this country and had the exact same feeling that you have. So it's probably more about training than about nationality, or perhaps both. And I think the Norwegian Theatre Academy in Fredrikstad, when you establish a new education, it takes time for it to find its form when you want to do something else. There was one school at the time, and it had been here for a long time already, with a tradition. So NTA has had different phases, and I mean, starting actually, my impression, I didn't start working there until 2007, so I'm actually a latecomer. trying to build on what other people did before, but it has been known because I've been in this environment, a theatre environment in Norway for some time before I started working there, so I had an impression of the school. At that time it was sort of had rumors, and the impression was that it was a physical theatre school and nobody really knew what they were doing, including myself. And people didn't really take it too seriously. It takes time to build up something, and to build up a technique and a tradition, and to define for yourself when you work in a place like that also what it is. I think we've had to contextualize our work and the journey in a way, and this beginning in an idea of a kind of physical theatre training, which I can relate to coming from Jacques Lecoq, has then other things has been added to it, and it's been building. Today I feel in Norway that it's much more connected to the international environment, thanks to many factors, thanks to the whole Norwegian society having opened up from corporates to arts. We are traveling more, we are better in English and so on. So it's not so strange anymore to do different ways of working with theatre, different techniques. The whole sort of independent scene has been professionalized. So I think all these things matters. I feel today, which is different from when I finished in '92 in Paris, that there's a bigger equality and understanding of the value of different ways of working, simply.
So, in a way, you describe a world or a situation where we all tend to be more eclectic somehow. And then I would be curious to hear again from you, Karolina, because it seems like, yes, you are very eclectic in the way that you try to find what is interesting for you, but you still go to very old traditions. Can you say something about the connection between being eclectic and pick something here and there, and then also dealing with old traditions? Do you understand?
Yes. For me, it's very important, the tradition, but what do you do with this tradition? It's impossible to create new things if you don't know about the traditions. It's very important for me. For example, in Chile, for the period of the dictatorship, the memory is rising. The new generations, we are know about the traditions. In the theater also, it's a crisis now. In Latin America also, I think. Okay, for example, talk about the postmodern theater, for example. But the real tradition in the Latin America, for example, the new generation, I don't know anything. For me, it's very interesting investigate about this, research about this. For example, I went to India. In India, I observed many things the same in Chile.
They lose their traditional acting.
The last year I went to Hyderabad University in India. In the young people, we talked about this yesterday. The young people want to do the theater, the Occidental style. They copy the Western. This is for me is what happened here. I'm in India. For me, it's very interesting. Because they want to act in English, the same that the acting studio, or the same the other style. They don't want to do the traditional arts in India, for example. In Occident, we want to copy the Orient. It's very curious.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Yeah, come on.
I just wanted to say that I think that within the Nordic context, there needs to start to become a discourse of post-colonial theater. That we are not outside of that just because we are in Norway. We're part of that economy, we're part of that global market.
Do you feel there is little knowledge about, or awareness about that?
I can't assume that. I haven't talked to everyone in this room, so I can't assume that. But I would suggest that part of what Carolina is talking about, and more of this awareness of the international scene, is an awareness of international economy, and that's where identities and migration are being appropriated and moved around, and also where a kind of freedom emerges with a lot of questions around it. So this post-colonial theater, which is a long discourse and tradition of its own, but to be aware of that way of questioning what we do, not just the postmodern or post-dramatic, but to understand ourselves as in another moment, something to talk about.
Do we have some traditions? What is the Nordic traditional theatre making or working or practices? Somebody want to answer that question?
It's Danish.
It's
Danish.
It's Danish.
Yeah.
Could you say 2 words about that?
I mean, historically, the first theater in this country was Danish actors coming here because we were occupied. So, and I don't know where the Danes got their stuff from, actually.
The Finnish maybe are more influenced from both Russia but also Sweden, I guess. If you talk about
I mean, we're talking about kingdoms here.
Yeah.
Sweden and Denmark, historically, where theater is connected to the royal, and about the Russian tradition in Norway, I think you can answer that better, how that got into this country, because that's not so old, is it? Because the theater school at Statens Teaterskole didn't particularly work with Russian, techniques until, in the 50s.
No. The first translation of Stanislavski's work to Nordic countries, I think, is in 41 or 2 or something. And it became very important both in Denmark and in Germany. It was read during the war, studied during the war. And so it was a more written knowledge, and then people started to work, and it of course was international, so people that was in touch with different. So it started out this way.
But if I can say something about this, the journey is very peculiar in Europe, because you have the American interpretation of Stanislavski that make Stanislavski's name popular. And then you have this tension of Cold War, and you have European countries which are closer to Russia to start to sort of turn and not just look at the States, searching for also other inspiration for training and inviting directly people from Russia, and also Poland actually had a big moment in the 80s. So there is a sort of paradox, and then you establish, especially in Scandinavia, you establish this very sort of tradition inspired from Tostonogov and St. Petersburg, and it seems like it has no connection with the Western idea of Stanislavski. But if there is the name Stanislavski in the mouth of people in Europe, it's only because of Hollywood. It's a very pop process, actually. Yes, because also in France and Italy, you have the Coupeau tradition. You have all the traditions more linked to that kind of way of thinking, acting, till almost the 80s.
To also summarize this, we have 2 important influences from Stanislavski after war in the Scandinavian countries. One is from Rudolf Penka, which you may have heard about, an East German pedagogue that was important in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. I'm insecure if it was in Finland. And then we had, that was in the 70s, and then the next big wave was the Tostonogov, a specific method of Stanislavski. We can talk about this later, but that came in the 90s with mostly Irina and some other teacher, Irina Majewska, which was here for some years, but also in Denmark. So we have different ways of different interpretations of Stanislavski. I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, about this Finnish tradition, of course, we also have a very, what I would call Gianluca said, Stanislavski is kind of a label or a topic that is very useful when you talk about a specific kind of theater and acting, and I'm not sure if that has anything to do with Stanislavski himself. I would call it, I've been beginning to call it the Lutheran tradition in theater acting, because it should be truthful, it should be realistic, it should be psychological. It's something it's very Lutheran for me. Probably a little bit Freudian, but more Lutheran, you know, it should be truthful. You have to be, you must be honest on stage. And that's of course an impossibility for an actor, because he and she is a liar. The occupation is an occupation of a liar and a joker. But and that's the hypocrisy. That's the problem actually. We can talk about it more on Friday. But the Finnish theater tradition, on the other hand, is of course it has its influences both from West and East, as everything in Finland has, and we are kind of there in between. But it's very different from the other Scandinavian countries. I'm not sure if Finland is one of the Scandinavian countries. I think it's something very separate. Because theater is hugely popular still in Finland. In this mute country, people tend to act and do theater. And we have a long tradition of labor theater, or amateur theater, and summer theaters. So Finnish, the audience, the amount of spectators per year, if you count all the amateur theaters in Finland, is around 5 million. And that's about how many we are. So it's a huge tradition that comes from the grassroots. And that's very different from the Russian tradition and from the Western tradition, which comes from the court, kind of. We haven't ever had a court. We don't ever have this tradition of court theaters. We have only people's theater, and that's something very special still in Finland.
Yeah. We also, of course, do have these things in Norway as well, but I think there seems to be a clear separation between what is called like amateur theater and professional theater. So you tend to have this way of thinking about amateurs as not something professional people deal with, which I think is a separation. I'm not sure how it is in Sweden, but I think it's the same in Denmark.
Oh, it's the same in Sweden.
Yeah.
Separate.
So, like social theater is not something that you do as an artist. I think it's changing at the time, but traditionally, I think we could say this. We are starting to get closer to the end of this first talk. I would be curious to hear from the audience if you also have some questions or remarks to make. You just have to raise your hand whenever, shout out, okay? You're always welcome to join the discussion, okay? If you want to do that.
Actually, we need it for the recording. It's not because so we get a good recording.
You don't have to. Just sing out if you raise your hand or something, okay? Or just shout out. I'm also curious. I mean, now we are some of us gathered here, and I think, from my perspective, it seems like the institutions in the Nordic countries. One thing is the institution in each country doesn't seem to communicate a lot, but it's also through the borders. I mean, it's very seldom that I think people from Stockholm come to see theater here, and the opposite. Just from the capital perspective, it's not much communication. I think this is how I feel it. You can oppose to me if you disagree, but if it is like this. If there is very little communication through the borders of this small place, I mean, we even have a language so we understand each other. We still don't seem to. I mean, you very seldom see a Swedish or Danish actor on stage in a Norwegian theater. Why? Somebody wants to say something about this?
It's just
very brief. Just to plug our lovely alumni, but that you know, the environment that we're educating people in is international and has quite a lot of people from the Scandinavian environment, and they're performing on the stages in this country, on the streets, on the stages, in the galleries, in different spaces. And I would suggest that for their generation, they're becoming quite visible. So I think
it's going to change.
I think it's changed. I think it's the eyes for those who are sitting at the center of power, what they are looking for and what they see. If they're looking at the National Theatre and saying who's on stage there, then they will have a very limited answer. But if they're looking at many different spaces, which are reaching a lot of different audiences in the Nordic environment, it's a totally different situation. If you don't mind me saying so.
I think it's changing too, both because, like in Sweden, we have a lot of people from outside of the Nordic countries coming in. It used to be in all the Swedish theater schools that you had to have the Swedish language and you could speak it good, otherwise you couldn't even apply. And it's not like that anymore. So you can have accents, and also dialects are more useful. So it's changing. And of course we have students in Gothenburg from Norway and Denmark, and had them from Denmark. So it's changing. It's taking time, I think.
What I just was sharing, what I was sort of surprised of when I came in, it's just from a commercial point of view. Because from a commercial point of view, I was like, come on, you guys understand each other. Why don't you make theater so that you can sell this stuff all over the place and think, I don't know, 20 million people instead of 5? It's like, so that in my first impression was a sort of surprise, because I saw a possibility which was not used in a way. I understand the borders of language if you don't understand each other. But when you do understand each other, it would be interesting to explore and have sort of create more sort of Scandinavian also theater scene, and also from the institution point of view. It would create also more revenues, I think.
I wonder if it's not traditional. I mean, I do agree it's changing, but also connected to the style of theatre that has been dominant in the big theatres, which has been so much about text and honesty. And I mean, I've encountered teachers from Scandinavian schools asking me how can they reach their emotions in a foreign language, which to me is totally absurd, because you know, you have mixed couples. Should they be able to share their feelings if they, you know?
I think it's interesting also to take into consideration that Barba, very fast after establishing his group, he traveled all around in Scandinavia. It's also an interesting point, I think. He made a choice about going abroad right away.
When are you amateur and when are you professional in the theater? I have this question. For example, the members of the theater, anything study in the institution of theater. The first I studied in Chile in the institution, but I go inside the group. It's completely the formation is not institutional. Since I have this question, and now the group is a reference in the theater. In this place, going the people around the world. In this week is the Odin week. Is the people in different countries, in China also. What happened here? Go different peoples in this house.
Super interesting questions. We are getting close to the end, and now, of course, people start to raise their hands and want to ask questions and come with arguments. So, but very briefly, okay? Because we really need to have the lunch.
As I was listening to you talking about the difference between the court tradition and the grassroots tradition and Huva Suomi here, I want to ask you, do you think, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, do you think that it is appropriate to say that the Sami, very new it's not so new actually, but the Sami theatre tradition emerges from the grassroots the same as the Finnish, opposed to from the rest of the Nordic countries. And how?
Yeah, my name is Ville, for everyone. I suppose it comes up from the grassroots. I think that this question about tradition and where the theatre comes from, I suppose we should separate them, as I think much of the theatre nowadays in all the Nordic countries come also from the grassroots. And not only in Finland, we are not kind of the only one, but this is a question about the tradition that we have and how it is in our, the whole system, the whole theatre network. It's something that lives in there, I think, more than a question about that the theatre in Norway, in Denmark and Sweden would be the court theatre anymore, but it's kind of effective still somehow. But I think Sami theatre comes from the grassroots. I think many of the different kind of theatre styles or devised theatre or whatever, theatre for the oppressed and these kind of things, what we could call the contemporary theatre, they come much from the grassroots or whatever we can call it. Unfortunately, this, when I got this mic, this question about who can apply to the Theatre Academy in Helsinki, I think we are still quite a long way from. We looked too much on this background, or how do, it's not possible for you to have a bad Finnish language when you apply. It's kind of impossible to get in. And I think it's really stupid and it's kind of old-fashioned and out of date, but we are old-fashioned in many ways.
Okay, I think we have to, I mean, if you're going to say something now, you have 2 sentences. And they should be short.
Hello. Brief historical comment. It's interesting that there was a strong Nordic intermingling for a long time after the war with Nordic theatre meetings and inspirations across the borders, but that somehow died out probably during the 70s or something. So I think it's very good that it's revitalized now, and also I think one has to, it's probably got something to do with the Anglo-American cultural hegemony. That more, and of course that you get cheaper tickets, so you didn't have to go to Stockholm, you could go directly to New York or wherever.
Short remark?
No, it's not short.
You want to do it tomorrow? Okay, keep it in mind. And then short remark from Laura.
It was just, I'm so glad that you asked a question about Sami theatre. Thank you for raising that in this space. It is really important that we remember that voice and that language and that culture within Norway when we talk about Nordic approaches, not to forget the land that we're on. But also that when you talk about language and exclusion, I mean, of course, any culture that cannot enter the state system will find a way to tell their own stories in their own language. So it's grassroots theater, but it's also theater that's based in a long tradition of community and language. And that's a whole, I think, to talk again about the post-colonial environment for theater making, that we don't let the institutions determine the discourse that we're using when we talk about theater, that we don't look from above and talk about those other theaters. That the way of knowing the world and the way of knowing theater comes from where we stand, not just, it's very, very subjective.
Great, thank you everybody. I wish you, thank you for the panel, and I wish you all a very great lunch, 1 hour, and then see you on the workshops.